Hello, Napoleon. You're quite good at turning me on.
You should probably ignore that.
One thing the ninja's famous for, I want to point out, is what is known as a death touch. The ability to hit someone, leave no bruise, no mark whatsoever, and yet kill them.
This sounds like a James Bond movie, you realize.
Well, the ninjas were the James Bonds of Japan.
Kept you waiting, huh? In the world of video games, Hideo Kojima is an auteur. That's French for pretentious. One of the most recognizable and successful designers of all time, he has made a career out of ripping off more movies than the Pirate Bay. His level of stardom is such that it affords him the creative freedom to design characters with names like Die Hard Man, or a female soldier who looks more like a stripper that wandered into an NRA convention, and somehow he keeps getting work. Kojima's best title is arguably Metal Gear Solid 3. I say arguably as anyone who's allowed to use the stove unsupervised knows the real answer is MGS1, and I'll fight you if you try and tell me any different. But in a universe filled with vampire soldiers, cyber ninjas, clones of clones of clones, and telepathic gremlins or whatever, MGS3 is a standout title simply for having an actual well-thought character arc for its main antagonist, the boss. I will now ask Napoleon to attempt the Sisyphean task of summing up a Kojima storyline in 2 paragraphs or less.
The boss is a legendary soldier who, in the crazy world of Hideo Kojima, was pivotal in winning the Battle of Normandy for the Allies and turning the tide of World War II. She's the mentor and friend of your character, Naked Snake, who is also known as Big Boss, and not to be confused with Solid Snake, who was a clone of Big Boss, or Liquid Snake, who is the brother of Solid Snake and is also a clone of Big Boss, but evil and also dead, but lives on in the surgically reattached hand of Revolver Ocelot, who was the boss's illegitimate child, and ultimately forms a terrorist group called the Sons of Liberty with Solidus Snake, not to be confused with Solid Snake, because Solidus Snake is actually the President of the United States, who is also a clone of Big Boss.
Snake, are you okay? Snake? Snake!
Okay, so while the plot of the Metal Gear universe has more shocking twists than a dominatrix specializing in ball torture, to cut a ridiculous story short, this legendary American soldier, the boss, defects to the USSR during the Cold War, and not the modern-day Cold War, the classic one you remember from Call of Duty Black Ops. You track her down, kill her, and save the day. But only afterwards is it revealed that the boss never actually defected. She had been ordered by her superiors to defect to get on the inside of the USSR and stop the development of a very anime type of nuclear weapon. The boss was so far undercover that in death, she sacrificed her name and reputation in service to her country. The public would never know that in truth, this traitor, who traded everything for which the United States stands for communal farming and informing on your neighbour, had died as one of the greatest American patriots. Frank Dux is a soldier, spy, sexual dynamo, and greatest martial artist of all time. He's the man who gave us his true life story in the form of 1998's greatest movie, Bloodsport. And I know what you're thinking right now, and the answer is, yeah, believe it or not, Bloodsport is allegedly a true story.
Meet Frank Dux, the first American to win the KUMITE, a deadly martial arts competition where the only rule is to win.
He's been the subject of innumerable documentaries, interviews and articles, but as the years pass, Dux has become somewhat of a laughingstock, as claim after claim of his is debunked. But the more I learn about Dux, the more I begin to wonder, is he less Solid Snake and more the boss? A legendary soldier whose actions were so covert that he is doomed to be considered a fraud thanks to the fact that his work can never be revealed publicly. I mean, aside from that one time he wrote a book detailing them in great length, but aside from that, this video aims to answer the question, is Frank Dux the secret man the greatest American ninja, elite soldier, CIA spook, child slavery abolitionist, KUMITE winning patriot of all time. Without a good backstory, there's no compelling reason for any hero or villain to exist. Frodo wants to destroy the One Ring out of an innate desire to rid Middle-earth of the evil that has corrupted his beloved Uncle Bilbo. Batman's parents are dead, and he never shuts up about it. And Jeff Monson sprang to life as if from a genie's lamp out of a deep desire to see people fornicate without any financial strings attached. Frank Dux' origin story begins in 1956 in the ice-blasted, frigid hellscape of Toronto, Canada. But it's really boring, so let's skip ahead to when the interesting shit starts. In 1996, Dux wrote this: The Secret Man, an ancient tome that chronicles his life, his loves, and all the top-secret missions he blundered his way through en route to becoming the world's greatest soldier spy martial arts CIA Green Beret karate champion of the world. For research purposes, and also because I paid 30 whole euros for the literary equivalent of a Creed greatest hits album and want to get my money's worth, I'll be basing a lot of my observations on Frank's life and deeds from his very own autobiographical fanfiction. Like most kids, Dux started training in martial arts as a way out of being bullied. A skinny Jewish kid living in a rough neighborhood in California, Dux wanted to learn to defend himself, but after his first loss at a judo tournament, we almost lost the greatest martial arts career of all time before it had even begun. In the locker room post-tournament, a despondent Dux struggled to hold back his tears of rage and frustration and considered giving up altogether. It's at this point that anyone who has seen the other chronicle of the life and times of Dux, Bloodsport, will notice a significant diverging of his origin mythos. In Bloodsport, Dux is introduced to the world of martial arts after his gang of pizza-faced preteen hoodlums attempt to steal a sword from the home of legendary martial arts instructor Senzo Tiger Tanaka. And not just any sword, this is the KUMITE sword, a priceless, irreplaceable loot drop you get after beating like 300 other guys in unarmed combat. But in The Secret Man, this never happens. Senzo Tanaka ghost dads his way into the locker room, materializing like the referee in IK Plus and offering the kind of wisdom that only stereotypical, borderline mystical old Asian men can. And while I get that stealing a priceless artifact that Senzo probably picked up in Narita Airport's duty-free section is a bit more Hollywood than him kinda creepily appearing in the boys' locker room.
I see you working with the young kids. Do you have a favorite kind of spot for the younger ones?
It's just one of many, many inconsistencies we'll find in the Frank Dux story. After their vaguely creepy locker room introduction, Dux began his ninja training with Tanaka. But for a legendary martial arts instructor, Senzo Tanaka is more elusive than the ghost of D.B. Cooper. Despite his status as an alleged KUMITE winner and head of the Koga Yamabushi School of Ninjutsu, Tanaka is more underground than the average sub-pop artist. Dux is the only martial artist to ever claim to have trained with him.
Shidoshi Tanaka, train me. What's the whole up?
And despite being a supposedly world-famous martial artist, there is not a single dojo, school or cardio kickboxing class affiliated with him. Finding information on Tanaka has practically become its own cottage industry, with people making hour-long videos and digging through more complex lineages than Genghis Khan just to try and prove this man actually existed.
However, I can prove, because of your last episode with Michael Bisping, that Senzo Tanaka is absolutely a real person.
One of the things you'll notice about Dux if you do even surface-level digging is his obsession with James Bond.
This sounds like a James Bond movie, you realize.
Well, the ninjas were the James Bonds of Japan.
People inspire me at that time.
Well, one was inspiration was Sean Connery in the James Bond series that fed my ego. You're a young man, you know, you see a guy, oh, he's getting all the girls, fancy cars, you know, adventure, excitement, never loses. And so that, in my visualization, has said, well, that's who I want to be when I grow up.
Written his own biography entitled The Secret Man. I want you to meet a real-life James Bond, folks, Frank Dux. Come on, Frank. There he is. Oh, my gosh, he's got a Bond girl. How are you? Good to see you. How you doing? Come on in. I think the man is going for a martini in the old Bond fashion with a Bond girl. Shaken, not stirred.
If you're a spy, what are you doing on TV telling everyone you're a spy? The idea of being a spy is that your life is secret and nobody knows about it. So what is this?
One place you can find Senzo Tanaka is in the James Bond movie You Only Live Twice. In it, a man named Senzo Tiger Tanaka commands an army of ninjas. Dux explained this bizarre coincidence by stating that despite being more underground than the fucking sandworms of Arrakis, somehow Ian Fleming had heard all about Tanaka and based his Bond villain on the real-life Senzo. It's taken 30 years of digging just to verify that yes, there was a man named Senzo Tanaka who lived and died in California at roughly the same times as Dux claims. Tanaka came from an area of Japan called Kumamoto, which has historical links to a practice called Yamabushi, which is indeed very similar sounding to Koga Yamabushi, the branch of ninjutsu Dux claims he trained. But before any Dux fans among you break out the champagne and hand lotion, the only problem is, Yamabushi is literally a form of meditation and mountain worshipping practiced by monks of that region.
山伏っていうのはそうですね、修験道は法的な考えがミックスされて、できた宗教なんですけども、まあ山伏というのはその山に伏してというふうに要する修験道の、坊さんと言ったらいいか行者。
Not a single mountain hugger interviewed here was capable of performing the dim mak, or even aware of what a dim mak is. In 1980, Frank wrote a manuscript titled Ninja, The Untold Story. It's 160 pages of ninja fanfiction, yet somehow manages to be more painfully dull than having a limb amputated with a spoon. Dux does, however, spend a significant allotment of the story performing literary fellatio on Senzo Tanaka. The list of Tanaka's accomplishments are truly inspirational. Let's take a look at a few examples and try to rate their credibility. At age 16, he took part in the Russo-Japan War. The 16-year-old Tanaka killed enough high-ranking Russian officers to make Joseph Stalin feel inadequate. Famous Russian lunatic Rasputin prophesied the coming of Senzo Tanaka. As it was prophesied, Tanaka ninja'd his way into the court of Tsar Nicholas II, beheaded his mistress, and left her head in his bed. Tanaka pulled a lethal weapon and was kicked out of the Japanese intelligence services during World War II for being a loose cannon who didn't do things by the book. He moved to San Francisco where he ninja'd the fuck out of the entire Chinese mafia. According to Dux, Senzo was regarded as the most famous ninja of his day, which seems about as useful as being the best guitarist in Nickelback or the hottest man on the Isle of Lesbos. The most interesting thing about this manuscript, once you cast aside all its bullshit and flimflammery, is not what it tells you, but what it fails to tell you. Despite listing everything from high-profile assassinations to the heft and texture of his bowel movements, not once does Frank mention that Senzo was a KUMITE champion, which seems like a glaring oversight given the importance of the KUMITE in Frank and Senzo's lives. Is it possible that Senzo Tanaka really was a legendary ninja and part of a lineage stretching back 40 generations? Yes, but unlikely. There is, however, a far more plausible scenario. The real-life Tanaka would have been a 70 or even 80-year-old man when he met Frank Dux. And as old men are wont to do, he likely told a young and impressionable boy stories. Tales of his homeland, where an ancient clan of priests offer silent prayers to a mountain deity who returns nothing but a cavernous silence of its own, and whispers of warriors unseen, hiding in the hills, were used to quell unruly children. Behave Yourself, or the invisible warriors, the shadow dancers of the sacred mountain will come and take you away. And maybe Frank enjoyed those stories just a little too much. Xenophanes was an ancient Greek philosopher who posited the notion that if horses and oxen could learn to draw, they would draw the gods as horses and oxen. If Frank Dux drew a picture of God, he would be wearing black pajamas and swinging a katana.
Well, ninja means someone whose spirit and skill is sharper than the edge of a blade.
Regardless of how Frank met Senzo, theirs was a love that bloomed on the battlefield. Senzo's nephews eventually got bored of ninja LARPing and went to do fun teenager things like squandering the gift of youth and dry humping. With no other competition for his affections, Frank was free to bask in Senzo's full attention, and bask he did. According to Dux's ancient ninja manuscript, Tanaka knew he was dealing with not just any teenager, but with the true heir to 40 generations of ninja cosplay. It's safe to say Senzo picked up a real ninja vibe coming off this kid, which may partially explain why, between the ages of 14 to 16, Senzo's training crossed over the border into full-on child endangerment, as Frank was made to do live fighting with real bladed weapons, fought a green beret, and had to have stakes strapped to his legs and get chased by a hungry Akita. So after 2 whole years of training,
what's the whole up?
He took someone else's teenage son on an unsupervised trip to, and I quote, the legendary ninja land of Masuda, which is odd as you would likely expect them to go to Kumamoto, seeing as that's where 40 fucking generations of Senzo's ninja great-grandparents lived, but whatever, maybe his ninja teleport abilities were a little off that day.
So, what is this?
At Masuda, the 16-year-old Frank learns every single ninja technique in the fucking ninja book, and then challenges the entire Koga clan for the right to be called ninja. I'm not making this up or exaggerating, this is legitimately all in Frank's manuscript. A 16-year-old Canadian challenges an entire clan of ninjas in the middle of a ninja village for the right to become a ninja. And again I quote, the boy's abilities shocked and pleased the ninja community, and he was awarded, in front of the entire Koga clan, the title of ninja. Having mastered the ninja art before he had even mastered growing facial hair, Dux moved on to the next arc of the Frank Dux cinematic universe, his military career. My name is Frank Dux. I was in Vietnam. I hold the record for most Vietnamese killed with a single roundhouse kick. It's 56. That was in 1993 and they still haven't let me back into the country. Frank's accomplishments as the greatest Canadian ninja are only matched by his military record.
Tell that dipshit to get fucked.
Dux is the owner of more medals, ribbons and awards than the average Call of Duty lobby. If you can name a country, there's a better than average chance Frank has fought there, or conducted a covert operation, or maybe just banged a really hot chick there.
Ain't nothing like a piece of pussy.
Because if the secret man is to be believed, Frank Dux is slinging more pipe than legendary sexual hobgoblin Ishida Kim. Dux is an awardee of the Navy Cross, Silver Star, Bronze Star, Distinguished Service Cross, Navy Marine Corps Medal, Purple Heart, Medal of Honor, and Medal of Honor Allied Assault. In an issue of Black Belt magazine from 1980, Dux revealed that he even received awards for his knife-fighting skills in active combat in Southeast Asia.
Y'all take a good look at this lump of shit.
His missions were so covert that even his awarding of the Medal of Honor had to be done in a secret ceremony.
All of us have taken an oath that we cannot get too much into the details by reason of the fact of security concerns, but he was into special operations and then, of course, operating with other government agencies.
He's a Vietnam veteran who conducted secret missions in Laos as part of Operation Sanction. In a tale straight out of an 80s Nam movie, Dux was the sole survivor of his entire team, though he didn't exactly escape unscathed. He was lucky to make it out alive, limping across the border into Thailand after receiving several bayonet wounds in his stomach and shrapnel in his back.
Everybody gotta die sometime, Red.
He worked for the CIA, NSA, FBI, and NordVPN. Speaking of NordVPN, fuck NordVPN. Frank's military and intelligence career is shrouded in more mystery than the pyramids of Giza. In order to try and make sense of it all, we need to start at the beginning.
Bob, I got a bad feeling on this one, alright? I got a bad feeling.
My name is Frank Dux. I was in Vietnam. There was no parade for me when I came home. Nobody called me a hero, aside from the articles I wrote about myself. But life isn't gonna just hand you the Medal of Honor, so I awarded it to myself. What we do know for indisputable fact, thanks to a Freedom of Information request from militaryphony.com, is that in 1975, at the age of 18 and only 2 years after becoming King of the Ninjas, Frank enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserves. He attained the rank of Lance Corporal, and his primary duty for his entire military career is listed as wireman, which is someone who repairs communications equipment. His active duty only lasted 130 days, ending in October of 1975. The lines begin to blur when Dux himself supplies a copy of his discharge papers, which show Basic Intelligence Man listed as his primary duty rather than wireman. This was investigated by Military Phony, who were able to confirm that Frank did indeed have basic intelligence training, but the kind of advanced intelligence training one might need to get into the CIA or FBI is nowhere to be seen. The reveal of Frank as having basic intelligence training might seem like a rare W for him, as it lends credibility to his tales of special forces, Green Beret, James Bond, covert missions, and licking strawberry jam off a woman's foot in the middle of a restaurant, which is actually a thing in his book, and I swear to God I'm not making up something as stomach-churning as that. But once we dig a little deeper, things fall apart faster than a Tony v. Habib main event. The first and most glaringly obvious structural flaw in Frank's House of Lies are his Vietnam stories. Numerous articles describe him as a Vietnam veteran, and even in his own book, he describes someone as an old buddy from Nam. But unless his recruitment office was a heavily modified DeLorean, it's impossible for Frank to be a Vietnam veteran, given that the war ended in 1973 and he enlisted in 1975. While GIs were busy dying face down in the mud, Frank was face down in Senzo's backyard, LARPing as Ninja Jesus. When this was pointed out, Frank immediately cast Reflect, claiming that he never said he was in Vietnam, but Southeast Asia as part of a special operations group on secret missions after the war had ended. But the actual special operations group that operated in Southeast Asia, known as the MACV SOG, had been disbanded by 1975. Duke's status as a permanent resident in the biggest land of make-believe since Middle-earth was confirmed when his military records showed that he had never left the United States at any point during his service. The next sandcastle to soccer kick was that of Frank's medals. The Medal of Honor is the highest award in the United States military, yet it was awarded to Frank in a top-secret hush-hush ceremony so as not to blow his cover, which, if true, would likely be the one and only time in history that the US military has ever awarded any medal of any description, let alone its top honor, in secret. The military aren't like the fucking Dragonborn, covertly sneaking their highest honor into someone's back pocket while attempting to pickpocket them. Sheldon Lettich, director of Bloodsport, dim-macked Frank's Medal of Honor claims in a particularly brutal fashion. Frank also used to tell me, and just about everyone he spoke to, that he had participated in secret missions for the CIA and the US military, and that he had won the Medal of Honor for his heroism. He even showed me the medal, which he had supposedly been awarded by the president. Years afterwards, when numerous people began questioning his stories, he stopped claiming that he won the medal, and then began claiming that he'd never told anyone he won it. He even tried to convince me that he'd never told me he won the medal, or that he'd even shown it to me. But by then his entire house of cards had collapsed, and nearly everyone knew he was just a delusional daydreamer and a big bullshitter. It's also pretty important to note that Frank claimed he was awarded the Purple Heart, which is given to soldiers injured in battle. Yet no mention of the injuries or the medal appear in his records. Without those, it would make it impossible for a veteran to receive the proper care from the Veterans Administration when they're discharged. Hence, there is a very good reason why these medals aren't awarded in secret or scrubbed from a soldier's DD-214. The only record of Dukes being injured while on active duty was described in the book Stolen Valor, when Frank apparently fell off a truck he was painting, which might be secret code for assassinating a battalion of Viet Cong using only the dim mak, but is more than likely just Frank falling off a truck. The covert operation in which Frank allegedly received his Purple Heart, Operation Sanction, is also about as realistic as my chances with Valentina Shevchenko. Oh shit, this is really happening. Play it cool, play it cool. Don't mention the spin kick, don't mention the spin kick. Hey girl. What was with that spin kick? Operation Wolf has more credibility than Operation Sanction. No one has ever heard of or found any records pertaining to Operation Sanction outside of Frank's big book of erotic military fanfiction. Oh, and Frank's claim that he won awards for his knife fighting skills? Yeah, those awards don't exist. The military is about as likely to give you an award for lightsaber skills as they are for knife fighting skills. But what about all those Vietnam photos and footage of Frank? They're from a short movie directed by Sheldon Lettich called Firefight. But if his medals are all make-believe, explain this photo, Napoleon, you draft-dodging hippie, I hear you say, probably. When it was pointed out that Frank is wearing a mixture of Marine and Army medals in this photo, which is something that would never happen, he backpedaled and claimed this isn't actually a photo of him in uniform, it's simply a hilarious Halloween costume. So in amongst all the sexy cats, sexy nurses, and whatever the fuck this monstrosity is, Frank was there in sexy full dress uniform. My name is Frank Dux, and as it turns out, I actually wasn't in Vietnam. I was, however, injured by a standard military issue M880 4x4 truck, possibly because it was a heavily disguised Viet Cong transformer. At this point, Frank's military claims have seen more poked holes than a teenage disco. A simple Freedom of Information request to see his DD-214 drops the hammer of dawn on the vast majority of his claims, as one single piece of paper proves that he never left the US and was never awarded any medals. And without that, all Frank has is some communications repair training and a budding career at Radio Shack. But what of Frank's other claims? That of being the titular secret man, the CIA's finest operative.
Значит, он мне, конечно, конкретно он не рассказывал, но так, в общем, говорил, что это человек с большой буквы, так он его называл. Человек с большой буквы, необычайной силы, воли, характера стойкого, но целеустремленный, такой, который может выполнить эту задачу, потому что это обычный человек не в состоянии, ему это не под силу, ни физически, ни интеллектуально, это должен быть.
In 1996, Frank detailed his life's work for the CIA in his magnum opus, The Secret Man, a novel that aims for James Bond but lands squarely on Navy SEAL copy pasta.
You think you can get away with saying that shit to me over the internet? Think again, fucker.
And at the risk of turning this video into a book review, I'm about to review this book, because if my life has to be made marginally worse by its existence, then so does yours. The Secret Man is a 316-page Jason Bourne fanfic written by someone who's only ever seen the one with Hawkeye in it.
So unpredictable, I gotta tell you.
In The Secret Man, Frank comes across like Forrest Gump with a military fetish. Somehow, Frank just happens to be present at all of the most incredible moments in covert ops history. By the end, I was almost expecting him to make an appearance at the Shadow Moses incident. If even 1/10 of this book is true, then Frank is legitimately the most badass human on the planet.
You're fucking dead, kid. I can be anywhere, anytime, and I can kill you in over 700 ways, and that's just with my bare hands.
The Secret Man's exploits contain, but are not limited to, Frank gets recruited into the CIA at age 19 in a public restroom. He hunts a serial killer who is in league with a big restaurant to murder street children because they were begging outside and made the restaurants look bad. Tracks down a Russian bioweapon that targets people based on their race. Is made a captain in the Russian army. Uses sleeping gas on someone's dog. Licks strawberry jam off a woman's foot in the middle of a restaurant. Gets into a deadly shootout with undercover KGB agents in downtown LA. Sells his KUMITE sword to save the lives of a ship full of orphaned kids who were kidnapped by pirates. Travels the globe meeting sketchy underworld characters in dive bars to shake them down for information. Blows up a fuel dump while fighting communists in Nicaragua. Blows up a chemical weapons plant in Iraq. And spends 3 days in a hotel room banging the hottest woman you can possibly imagine. You know who I'm talking about. That woman that you're obsessed with. You follow her on Instagram, where you like every single photo she posts, occasionally getting the courage to comment, "Looking good," after you've had a couple of beers, and then spend the next day with the nervous shits, worrying about whether or not it was a good idea. Well, now picture her, Frank Dux, an unlimited room service strawberry jam, locked in a hotel room for 3 days. 3 whole days.
All I can tell you is I'm not the type of guy who kisses and tells, and I took an oath, and I plan on obeying that oath.
The Secret Man gives you more ridiculousness to unpack than a joke shop warehouse. And if you don't know what a joke shop is, see, in the 1980s we didn't have jokes of our own, so we bought jokes from actual physical shops, but that's unimportant right now. What is important is that literally every one of those claims, from the strawberry jam incident to rescuing orphans from pirates, are all true stories, allegedly, but most of these stories fall apart under even the slightest bit of scrutiny. I can't find a single report of a fatal shootout between the FBI and undercover KGB agents in downtown LA in broad daylight, despite the fact that it would have caused an international incident and sounds like the prologue for Red fucking Dawn, but I guess it was just too covert. And unless the KUMITE sword is made from a solid gold unicorn horn glued to a copy of Half-Life 3, most Somali pirates wouldn't trade a ship full of valuable orphans for one. Like the majority of Frank's life, the tales found within The Secret Man are ridiculous to the point of being a middle finger to your intelligence. But Frank dismisses the lack of evidence to back up any of his whimsical bullshit by saying, "It was a secret." The Secret Man commits the cardinal sin of any book. It's more painful to read than a eulogy for a beloved pet. For a globe-trotting tale of espionage, sex and secret missions, I spent most of my time reading this book fighting a covert war of my own against sleep. Putting all of Frank's bullshit aside for a second, if The Secret Man was an Andy McNab novel, it would probably be one of the better ones, which is what we call damning with faint praise. The best part of The Secret Man is, unsurprisingly, the part you don't have to read. Midway through the most insane narrative outside of a Sutter Kane novel, Frank gives us photographic evidence of his life as an even hornier James Bond. It starts with photos of him breaking boards and doing a death touch on an inanimate object before moving on to photos of his covert ops, which look suspiciously like stock photos of military operations. Photos so small that I could realistically claim they're photos of me on a secret operation to destroy the You'd Be Surprised master tapes, and you'd have a pretty tough time disproving it. The one photo where Frank is clearly visible, titled as Down in the Trenches in 1983, also looks suspiciously like a still from the short movie Firefight. But the best is saved for last, when we're introduced to Frank, the chameleon, master of disguise. Everything from wearing sunglasses and a cheap wig, to wearing a fake mustache over your real mustache, to puffing your cheeks out a bit, are all CIA-sanctioned field disguises for use by the elite covert op on the go. After publication, secret agents were crawling out of the woodwork to distance themselves from Frank Dux. In August of 1996, Soldier of Fortune magazine published an article about Dux and the Secret Man, brutally titled Full Mental Jacket. In the literary equivalent of being pulled apart by horses, Soldier of Fortune spoke to a number of people Dux claimed were covert ops workmates of his and systematically destroyed any lingering shred of credibility Dux may have had. Actual real-life, non-fantasy SEAL Team Commander Larry W. Simmons was talked into writing the foreword for the book, as both he and Dux had the same literary agent, but upon publication, Simmons tried to have his name removed from it. He said, "As soon as I read the first few pages, I knew I'd been deceived into lending credibility to a fraudulent endeavour. He is not an American warrior, he is a con man." Dux also made claims about General John Singlob, saying they had met at a Covert Ops Expo in 1993. And as a brief aside here, having an expo for Covert Ops like it's Comic-Con with night vision goggles seems a bit counterproductive for people trying to keep a low profile, but whatever. Singlob claimed to have never even met Frank and said, "You know, it's an insult to your intelligence, on the subject of special operations, to think that this guy Dux could say he's involved in these things." Singlob also described the book as virtually a complete fabrication. He had his lawyers call the book's publisher and demanded it be removed from publication. Robert Gates, then deputy of the CIA, said, "I never heard of this guy, and no one I know in the intelligence community ever heard of him." And in an unusual move for the CIA, they made a public statement denouncing any links between them and Dux. CIA spokesman Mark Mansfield said, "Mr. Dux' book is sheer fantasy. He was never employed by or affiliated with the CIA."
So, what is this?
When Soldier of Fortune contacted Dux to ask for clarification of the events of his book, Dux claimed he couldn't answer any questions because it would endanger him and his family, despite the fact that he had just written a 316-page book that spilled more confidential stories than a teenager's diary. The intelligence community dismissed The Secret Man as a work of pretty low-effort fanfiction, and Dux himself as a complete charlatan. But as always, Frank was able to maintain that this was just the CIA and the military denying his existence because that's just how secret he was. Frank would eventually claim that he had never said he was employed by the CIA, despite, stating that he was the CIA's finest covert operative right on the front cover of his fucking book, and doing interviews where he talked about that one time where he was employed by the CIA.
And how long did you work for the CIA?
I worked directly for William Casey from 1981 to 87.
Frank's intelligence career can be defined entirely by its stunning lack of intelligence. When Frank Dux finally shuffles off this mortal coil and goes to that great KUMITE in the sky, I sincerely hope that his legacy won't be that of half-baked military fanfiction and sub-Austin Powers level James Bond rip-offs. Because despite his proclivity for spewing more bullshit than a malfunctioning slurry tank, Frank gave us the greatest gift anyone could have bestowed upon martial arts fans: Bloodsport. It's time to talk about the
What's the whole up?
For years the rumours have circulated. Those with an ear to the ground have heard fantastic tales of an invisible organisation. An organisation that sponsors an international, no-holds-barred tournament, pitting dedicated martial artists of all arts against each other in bare-knuckle KUMITE.
In November of 1980, Black Belt magazine published an article with a little-known karate instructor called KUMITE, a learning experience. The first sign that this was not your run-of-the-mill interview was the disclaimer that while Black Belt felt confident running the article, they were unable to verify many of the details of the instructor's fantastical tales. Tales of shadowy organizations that, once every 5 years, held a top-secret, invitation-only, bare-knuckle competition to determine who the world's deadliest martial artist was.
A lot of people liken it to a human cockfight. You've got to understand that Asia is lined with one secret society after another. And that's probably why the event has been kept secret for so long.
Fights could be won only by submission, KO, or death. That little-known instructor's name was Strength Fighter. No, wait, shit, it was Dux. It was Frank Dux. The article was the world's introduction to what Frank called the KUMITE. The word KUMITE is Japanese and generally translates to sparring. But in the topsy-turvy world of Frank Dux, KUMITE means roughly 1,170 people beating each other senseless over the course of 3 days in a top-secret, illegal, no-holds-barred fight to the death. The Black Belt article contains more wild inaccuracies than the average Steven Seagal shootout. At one point, they state that Dux has no knowledge of previous competitions before proceeding to detail all of Frank's knowledge of previous competitions. He discusses at least 3 previous KUMITEs, and if we run the math on this, if Frank had knowledge of 3 previous KUMITEs by 1980, and he won his first KUMITE at age 19, that means he has been competing in no-holds-barred death matches since the age of 9. Over the 6-page span of this interview, the reader is treated to more fantasy fight discussion than a schoolyard conversation about whose dad is the toughest. One year the KUMITE was a mud wrestling match, one year it was held on a cone-shaped surface, and I still have trouble sleeping as my brain attempts to conjure an image of how in the name of the patron saint of professional fisting that is even possible. One of the many questions surrounding the KUMITE that has never been answered is how many participants were there? According to Frank, every fighter fights 20 matches per day, and 3 matches are happening at all time. Every time a fighter loses, he exits the competition, so using what we know, how many competitors are there? After literal minutes of trying to work this out, I gave up and sought the help of the most advanced artificial intelligence the world has ever seen. ChatGPT is a deity born of code and bare metal, an oracle of silicone and semiconductors that stands as testament to man's recklessness in pursuit of unfettered technological advancement. An atom bomb with a user interface, a downloadable death knell for human thought. Yet even this, the most advanced AI known to man, was unable to make sense of the fucking KUMITE. No matter how I plugged in the variables of Frank's Fantasy Fight Club, it gave me a different answer every time, ranging anywhere from 4 competitors to over 400. And look, I'm not trying to body shame anyone here, but one of the most unrealistic parts of this article is the fact that this man ever claimed he was a heavyweight. The fucking trophy looks like it weighs more than he does. Black Belt editor Jon Stewart would later apologise for publishing martial arts fanfiction in his martial arts fanfiction magazine. Stewart said, "Sometimes we get caught, sometimes we were naive enough to think this added up." While the overall article is about as grounded in reality as Harry Potter's dream journal, Frank does make one Nostradamus-level prediction that is shockingly accurate. When asked about what type of fighters would be victorious in a style versus style competition such as the KUMITE, Dux put forward the idea that the key to winning was not being the best sumo wrestler or karateka, but being cross-trained in a number of styles. In an oddly prescient way, Frank predicted the rise of the mixed martial artist. 8 years after its publication, thanks in part to Black Belt editor Jon Stewart writing a note explaining Frank as the #1 ninja expert in the world, Hollywood opened its doors to Frank Dux. In 1976, the Sex Pistols played a gig at the Manchester Lesser Free Trade Hall. It was a small gig and only a handful of people turned up. When they returned 3 weeks later, they played to an audience of hundreds and properly ushered in the era of British punk. In any other timeline, that first gig would have been forgotten, and their triumphant return a few weeks later would be the show everyone remembers. But for those few dozen people in attendance, that first night at the Lesser Free Trade Hall was the splitting of the punk atom and the show that would go down in history as possibly the most influential gig of all time. In attendance that night were future members of Joy Division and then New Order, The Smiths, The Fall, and 2 men who would go on to found the hugely influential Factory Records. All of these artists would later claim that this show was what convinced them to start a band. The ripple effect of that gig can still be felt today. Frank's Sex Pistols moment was the 1988 martial arts classic, Bloodsport.
A flying jump kick 7 feet in the air. A secret arena. And a deadly competition. An American ninja in Hong Kong. In pursuit of a dream and pursued by his own government. It's the stuff martial arts films are made of. Comic book heroes with supernatural abilities. But the most unbelievable part of Bloodsport is that it really happened.
And at the risk of turning this video into a movie review, I'm about to review this movie because Bloodsport is so good it makes decades of Frank's bullshit all seem worthwhile. It's difficult to know where to start when discussing a movie where every second of its runtime is somehow crammed with excellence. Do we start with young Frank and his Belgian by way of California with a hint of speech impediment accent?
You're not gonna call the cops?
Not if we make a deal.
What kind of a deal?
How about Ray Jackson absolutely owning every scene he's in?
Jackson, you really going to Hong Kong?
I love anything with full contact. Need a few more scars on my face.
I heard you can get killed at that KUMITE.
Only if you fuck up.
Okay, USA.
Easy. Maybe the scene where Frank and Ray play 80s arcade game Karate Champ. Or maybe this guy. I don't know who he is, but he's clearly the Boba Fett of Bloodsport. He doesn't do much, but just look at how fucking cool this guy is. And what about this lovable rogue?
What's the whole up?
Bloodsport is a thorough retelling of KUMITE, a learning experience, and was directed by Sheldon Lettich, who previously worked with Frank on the short movie Firefight. Sheldon said of Bloodsport, "I had known Frank for a number of months before I came up with the idea for Bloodsport. Frank told me a lot of tall tales, most of which turned out to be bullshit, but his stories about participating in this so-called KUMITE event sounded like a great idea for a movie. Bloodsport is corny, it's badly acted by almost everyone involved, and its fight scenes do not hold up well in an era of John Wick doing Sambo on the back of a horse or whatever. But nonetheless, Bloodsport remains one of the best martial arts movies of all time. And in all seriousness, I just need to point out how much I absolutely love how grimy and oppressive the aesthetic of this movie is. Filmed on location in Hong Kong, it's one of the few movies to ever record scenes inside Kowloon Walled City before it was demolished in 1993. Every scene filmed there is strikingly brutal, and its visual influence can be seen in everything from Ghost in the Shell to Call of Duty Black Ops. A martial arts movie lives or dies by its action scenes, much like a musical is judged by its songs. Bloodsport is more or less non-stop action. From the moment young Frank pokes his head into Tanaka's window, it's wall-to-wall training montages, kinda sexual torture, dim mucks and death matches. The foil to Frank's all-American good guy, despite being a Canadian portrayed by a Belgian, is Chong Li. Frank insists Li is based on a real person who killed 6 people in one KUMITE. And can we just take a second to appreciate that Bolo Young, who played Chong Li, was 53 at the time? Look at this absolute unit. For contrast, here he is in Enter the Dragon 15 years earlier, looking virtually identical. For a film that garnered such a vast and dedicated following, Bloodsport was shockingly not particularly well received. Even today, its Metacritic score is a dismal 29, but its user score is 7.9, proving what anyone with common sense knew all along. That applying a points out of 10 scale to judge the merit of a piece of art, whose appreciation is subjective to each individual, is absolutely fucking pointless. Regardless of review scores, Bloodsport earned $50 million at the box office in its first year, and spawned 3 sequels that I'd be willing to bet no one has ever seen.
But they should!
Because if I have to watch Bloodsport 4 The Dark KUMITE, then I'm taking you down with me.
A champion. He triumphs in the KUMITE, the ultimate contest of warriors. A cop.
I thought you were dead. You so wrong.
Take the shot. You got him.
He loses his chance to save another cop's life. Now, obsessed with revenge, he is driven over the line.
The hell have you done?
To a prison where insanity reigns.
No rules! There are no rules!
Take the shot, John!
Bloodsport 4, The Dark KUMITE.
Okay, I realize this is the least of that trailer's problems.
Take the shot. You got him.
But that subtitle, The Dark KUMITE? Really? The first KUMITE had enough bodies at the end to fill a mass grave. How the fuck is it getting any darker than that?
I seem to misplace my pen.
Oh, I guess that's how. Sequels aside, Bloodsport's effect on pop culture was seismic. If you're an MMA fan, then you can probably give Bloodsport some small thanks for that. The idea of a no-holds-barred tournament pitting fighters of various styles against each other was undeniably influential on Art Davey and Horian Gracie when they came up with the first draft of the UFC. I mean, the original design of the octagon was going to be a flat surface surrounded by an alligator-filled moat, and if that doesn't sound like something straight out of the KUMITE, then I don't know what does. Pop culture icons like Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter, games that took the idea of international secret fighting tournaments, also owe a debt of gratitude to Jean-Claude Van Damme, Sheldon Lettich, and through gritted fucking teeth, Frank Dux. And while you can argue that Dux basically just stole the idea of the KUMITE from Enter the Dragon, and that his notions of combining all styles to be successful was essentially ripping off what Bruce Lee tried to do with Jeet Kune Do in the 70s, it doesn't change the fact that following the release of Bloodsport in '88, its influence could immediately be felt in everything from Street Fighter II in '91 to the UFC in 1993. Some of the greatest fighters of all time also cite Bloodsport as their gateway to martial arts. GSP, Anderson Silva and Bas Rutten to name but three. One of the hardest pills to swallow in all of MMA is that an alternate timeline exists where Frank Dux decides no one will ever buy this bullshit story about the KUMITE, cancels his interview with Black Belt, and GSP grows up to become a paleontologist instead of a mixed martial artist. Movie Frank would go on to win the KUMITE, avenge Senzo's honor, bone the ubiquitous love interest, and return to whatever top-secret espionage duties the army normally assigns to a sweaty-palmed 19-year-old. But not before we're treated to this screen. And for most people, this freeze frame provided near-fatal tonal whiplash. In a twist worthy of Shyamalan, Bloodsport goes from hokey martial arts movie to biopic in a split second, a move that is roughly as shocking as the end of the Terminator 2 director's cut.
What the fuck?
Years later, Sheldon Lettich discussed the reality of the KUMITE and said, "There was one guy Frank introduced me to named Richard Bender, who claimed to have actually been at the KUMITE event and who swore everything Frank told me was true. A few years later, this guy had a falling out with Frank and confessed to me that everything he told me about the KUMITE was a lie. Frank had coached him in what to say." Till this day, Frank still claims that the KUMITE is as undeniably real as gravity.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
But anyone with basic intelligence can see that the story has more holes in it than Batman's parents. Why has no other KUMITE winner ever spoken about the competition? In its hundreds of years of existence, surely someone other than Frank would have been allowed to talk about it. If Frank is 329-0, how come none of his 329 opponents have ever been found? If he competed in the 1980 KUMITE as he claimed, then how come his record never changed from 329-0? Frank claimed he set a record for fastest kick at 72 miles per hour, but how was it even possible for video cameras in the 1970s to measure the speed of kicks so accurately when they absolutely didn't have that kind of technology back then? And even if it was all recorded by high-speed cameras, why has none of that footage ever surfaced? Oh wait, I apologise. Footage of the KUMITE does exist. Frank silenced all his doubters when he released the shockingly real, unquestionable footage proving once and for all that the KUMITE was real. But unfortunately it was recorded on a Nokia 3310 that was covered in strawberry jam. The resulting video is so low resolution and monochromatic that Frank could claim to be fighting a mirror match against himself, and you'd have a hard time disproving it. Also, this looks suspiciously like footage from any one of the countless number of full-contact karate tournaments that took place in the 70s and 80s, not a secret illegal death match. The holy trinity of martial arts bullshitters are arguably Dux, Ishida Kim, and Count Dante. There's a thread of deceit woven into the fabric of each man, an invisible yet indelible strand that links all three men at their very core. They all claim membership of the Black Dragon Fighting Society. The BDFS is either a secret society that has existed in the shadows for millennia, or a marketing gimmick started by Dante to sell copies of his deadliest fighting arts book. While he is considered by many to be a fake martial artist, Dante was allegedly a real criminal with a propensity for solving problems by blowing them the fuck up, and I unironically love everything about this man. Ishida Kim, as we all know, is the world's horniest ninja and original weeaboo. Kim claimed to have trained with Dante and been a student of the Black Dragons, and can be seen here doing the Kata Dante, which is either a deadly assassination method named after the Count himself, or a grown man having an upright seizure in the middle of an interpretive dance routine. Frank Dux not only claims Black Dragon lineage, but the organisers of the KUMITE were none other than the Black Dragon Fighting Society. Frank's spot in the KUMITE was actually as an alternate for Dante himself, after Dante was unable to compete due to being dead, possibly by death touch. A lot of people really want to believe in the KUMITE, and I get it. Some of us grew up with battered VHS copies of Bloodsport, watched and rewatched until they invariably fell apart. It's a big part of a lot of people's lives, and the KUMITE is fucking cool. It's real life Street Fighter 2, and it makes style versus style fighting look badass, instead of what it actually looks like, which is some ponytailed taekwondo dork getting savagely humped by a wrestler. But it's been 30 years, and there is still zero evidence the KUMITE ever happened, at least the way Dux described it. In order to believe in the KUMITE, you have to have a childlike belief in an improbable narrative spun by a man whose life is defined by improbable narratives, while simultaneously ignoring the mountain of evidence to the contrary. In order for the KUMITE to be real, Frank would have to be a man with a capital M. He would have to have unparalleled physical and mental strength, character, and determination. The kind of man who could complete such a mission because a normal person would be incapable. The agent would almost have to be a Superman to commit all of this. But Frank isn't Superman, and the KUMITE isn't real. Frank's later years were not kind to him. His martial arts career arguably peaked in 1993 when he did a live performance in Bercy Stadium, France. There, thousands of French people flushed money right down the toilet after they paid to watch him smash bottles that seemed suspiciously like sugar glass and punch his way through bulletproof glass. The downward spiral began later that year when Dux was assaulted by former UFC heavyweight Zane Frazier at a martial arts convention. Despite Frank spending years training blindfolded in order to detect attacks from any angle, somehow a man who is 6'6" and 230 pounds snuck up behind him and sucker punched him. And while the idea of Frank's ninja training being completely useless in the exact scenario it was designed for is pretty hilarious, it was nevertheless a serious assault that Dux claimed did lasting damage to him.
And it shows in my medical conditions. I have 4 square indentations in my skull from being hit with brass knuckles.
In Frank's version of the story, Frazier jumped him with a gang of UFC fighters who ultimately all got their asses kicked by Dux. Because of course they did.
The CCTV cameras captured it. The CCTV cameras captured me fighting off 4 top fighters of the UFC. I won't mention their names.
Regardless of how it went down, the resulting injury forced Dux to undergo a brain scan, the results of which were no laughing matter. Frank discovered he had been living with multiple brain tumours. Dux even claimed that he wrote The Secret Man because he wasn't expecting to survive, and wanted to get his 100% true life story out there before he died. Frank did survive, but not without significant cost. He was blinded in his left eye and suffered facial paralysis and memory loss. To further compound the fall of Frank, in 1994, his house was destroyed by an earthquake, and to add insult to injury, his wife left him. And in one of the most tragic bromance breakups since the dissolution of McLobov, Frank sued former friend and Bloodsport star Jean-Claude Van Damme for breach of contract over writing credits for the Van Damme movie The Quest. Dux and Van Damme had been friends since Bloodsport in '88. Frank was even dating Van Damme's sister-in-law, but Dux lost the court case and then lost an appeal, and the hottest martial arts power couple, Van Dukes, ceased to exist. But in his most unforgivable act, Dux was allegedly offered $25,000 to assassinate Steven Seagal, and he didn't take the job.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that.
I'd be willing to concede that had Dux performed a successful hit on legendary blues musician and dancehall icon Seagal, he'd be a celebrated figure in the martial arts community, and we'd all be a lot more accommodating of his tales of the KUMITE. The rise of the internet was the death knell for Dux' career. While in the 1980s it was as easy as this to convince someone you were a CIA ninja.
Have you ever heard about a championship called the KUMITE?
It's like the Super Bowl of martial arts. The winner is the Ultimate Warrior.
I am that champion.
Oh, cool!
The free exchange of information over the internet meant that suddenly it was a lot harder to convince people about your track record in no-holds-barred death matches. Ultimately, Dux' greatest opponent would be the invention of search engines. All of which brings us to today. Dux is still telling anyone who'll listen that the KUMITE is real, that Senzo is real, that he really did become king of the ninjas at 16, that he really did get recruited into the CIA in a public restroom at age 19, and many, many other tall tales. And in a weird way, I admire that. He is nothing if not dedicated to maintaining his fantasy kingdom, and it might be surprising to hear after literally everything I've said over the last hour, but I like Frank Dux. Frank represents a period in martial arts that can never and will never exist again. A time when you could tell someone that you were a ninja and all you had to do was make a kind of claw shape with your fingers and they'd probably believe you. A time when you didn't immediately dismiss the dim mak as being complete nonsense. It was stupid and it was goofy, but it had character. Here we are 40 years later still talking about Kim and Dux because they were characters. If anyone's still talking about the latest Dagestani wrestler to hump his way across the UFC in 40 years' time, I'll be genuinely shocked. Maybe because I grew up with a dad who scared the living shit out of me with his tales of the witch who lived in the woods nearby, or that every scratch on his weather-beaten hands had been caused by a tiger he'd wrestled at work that day. But I have a pretty high tolerance for bullshit artists like Dux. But after months of writing and researching Frank, I still feel no closer to any kind of understanding of who he really is. Every facet of his existence is so completely wrapped up in stories straight out of a Bond movie, and he is so ruthlessly committed to maintaining them that at times even I found myself wondering if his entire life is one colossal house of lies, or if he really is the most interesting man alive. If Dux came clean and admitted everything was a lie, I genuinely think he'd be viewed a lot more favourably. Sort of like a Jordan Belfort Wolf of Wall Street style conman. The kind of lovable rogue who can go from villain to hero in the public eye with one good biopic. But Frank's realm of fantasy is holding fast. He does not waver in its defense. He is, and will remain forever, the Secret Man.
What the fuck did you just fucking say about me, you little bitch? I'll have you know, I graduated top of my class in the Navy SEALs, and I've been involved in numerous secret raids on Al-Qaeda, and I have over 300 confirmed kills. I am trained in guerrilla warfare, and I'm the top sniper in the entire U.S. Armed Forces. You are nothing to me but just another target. I will wipe you the fuck out with precision, the likes of which has never been seen before on this earth. Mark my fucking words. You think you can get away with saying that shit to me over the internet? Think again, fucker. As we speak, I am contacting my secret network of spies across the USA, and your IP is being traced right now, so you better prepare for the storm, maggot. The storm that wipes out the pathetic little thing you call your life. You're fucking dead, kid. I can be anywhere, anytime, and I can kill you in over 700 ways, and that's just with my bare hands. Not only am I extensively trained in unarmed combat, but I have access to the entire arsenal of the United States Marine Corps, and I will use it to its full extent to wipe your miserable ass off the face of the continent, you little shit. If only you could have known what unholy retribution your little clever comment was about to bring down upon you. Maybe you would have held your fucking tongue. But you couldn't, you didn't. And now you're paying the price, you goddamn idiot. I will shit fury all over you and you will drown in it. You're fucking dead, kiddo.